this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I realize in this era of 24-hour access to information and very short attention spans, we in the media must constantly be reassessing and reinventing the ways we deliver the news in an effective, compelling, honest way. While people believe the media plays an important role in democracy, sadly, their trust in journalists is at an all-time low. So we want to hear from three guests this morning who we hope can help us understand not only how we got here, but what they think might be next on the horizon. So I first want to introduce Travis County Commissioner Gerald Daugherty, who's not a journalist, but we thought would bring some interesting perspective. He's an elected official, and he's going to talk about how media changes have impacted his work as a local government official. And in 2017, Gerald's team won a regional Emmy for outstanding achievement for a single spot campaign commercial. This went viral. You guys have probably all seen it. And it really gave Gerald and his wife, Charlene, who's really the star of the commercial, a taste of the power of social media. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then we have Kathleen McElroy, who's the Associate Director of the School of Journalism at the University of Texas. And Kathleen has about 30 years in the business as a professional journalist.
I started when I was 5.
Good one. I believe you. Do you believe me? She's worked in various markets, including a long tenure at the New York Times. And we hope that you can share some perspective on the changes, especially from that traditional print media perspective. Talk about change. And finally, down on the end, we have Talia Shroud. She is the director of the Center for Media Engagement at the University of Texas. And Natalie studies and teaches about the media's role in shaping political attitudes and behaviors. That's an important topic these days, right? So we want you, Talia, to share kind of how we as consumers are changing the ways we consume news and how that impacts us in so many different ways in our society today. And also, unlike past discussions where I'm simply a moderator, because I care about this topic so much, you may hear me chime in a little bit and give a few opinions from a broadcast journalism perspective where I've spent my entire career. So thank you all for giving us your time and expertise this morning. I want to start with just a broad question for Talia and Kathleen. What do you teach your students about the role of the media in government, the role of journalism in democracy? I'll start with you, Talia.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be here. This is a wonderful panel. And so what I teach my students about the role of media and journalism in a democracy is based on the literature showing that it plays an incredibly important role, that if they want to think about themselves as journalists or as people who are conveying news to others, that they take on an enormous civic responsibility for doing so. Because if you look at what happens in cities when a newspaper loses a lot of staff or when a newspaper closes down, it has such a tremendous effect on what's happening in that community. So you see voter turnout go down. You see fewer people running for office. When the media are less likely to cover elected officials, they are less likely to stand on committee hearings. They're less likely to bring money home to the district. So the media play this incredibly important role within communities, and without them, it's a really scary environment where government isn't being as accountable to the public. And so I really convey the role of journalism and media as being this incredibly important intermediary between the citizenry and government, and really helping to meet the information needs of communities. So that's the take that I have when I'm talking with students about those issues.
I go all Spider-Man. I tell my students with great power comes great responsibility, and they get that. And if you think of the role media played with Hurricane Harvey, I found out that some of the small publications, they said people were calling them instead of 911, or how important it was that even if it was just online, that they were still able to find out what was open, what wasn't open. So yeah, there's this great political responsibility and democratic responsibility, but there is this civic responsibility that publications have.
And I think sometimes people love to hate the media, but boy, they want to use the media when it's there to give them information that's life-saving in many cases. So Gerald, I want to talk to you, Commissioner, I want to talk to you about how you as an elected official, I know that you're constantly wrestling with these complicated and competing policies. What do you see as the media's role in getting, these messages out on these issues that the county is working on? And have you seen it change? Because you've been an elected official for quite some time.
Well, thank you for having me. I certainly have an opinion about the media. Being an elected official, when I first started about 12 years ago, you always wanted to try to get in front of the media because the media was basically your friend. I mean, it was an outlet that you could depend on getting a message, albeit a lot of times people that are in office are trying to get a message to people that is somewhat an opinionated message, but you still want people to understand that. Today, I think most elected officials try to stay away from the media because it has turned out that it's not always your friend. Media is famous for wanting sensationalism. They want controversy. Because quite frankly, people aren't really interested in the media unless, you can, put a spin on it to where you get people talking about it. And now I can understand why media does that, but that is, something that has changed for me drastically from 2001, which is the first year that I ran for office, to this last time in 2016.
I actually want to add to that. I agree with the commissioner here in the sense that if we don't train reporters to understand the depth of what they're reporting or the deep layers of it, it's easier to report he said, she said. I call it manufacturing conflict, the way Chomsky talked about manufacturing consent, in the sense that, it's easy to say this side wants this and this side wants this, and everything's covered as a horse race or sensational quotes as opposed to really looking at issues. So I do find that too.
But Talia, to me, this is a really troubling trend because it plays into just what you said in that if politicians and people who are elected officials are shying away from the media because they're concerned that their message is going to be perhaps misconstrued or misrepresented or inflated to cause controversy, then we can't do our jobs. So what is the answer there? I mean, is it that politicians, I'm going to make a suggestion to Commissioner Daugherty, maybe you find the reporters that you do trust, that you do feel like are covering issues, and that's who you grant interviews to. Just a suggestion, because I don't think you should shy away from the media.
Well, and I know it's time for Talia to respond to that, but something very egregious happened to me with the media where they came in under the guise of wanting some information, and they were filming me with a second person out of a seedy-looking black satchel that I had no idea that was the case.
Is this the news media?
This is the news media.
I mean,
and I called
a local news media?
A local news media, and I called the general manager the next day. I mean, because when I came to the office, people said, "Oh, Commissioner, we're sorry that they ran that piece on you last night." And I went, "I don't even know what in the world you're talking about." So I get back to the office, and I start trying to find out what they were talking about, and one of the local channels had indeed done that. And when I called the general manager that I knew, I just couldn't believe his response. Everything is game for us. And we were afraid that you weren't going to speak to us. And anybody that knows me, I mean, I'll speak.
Yeah,
I'll speak
we know
to
you'll
you.
speak to us.
I'll speak to you with whatever you want to talk about. So it was just, I mean, you can imagine what it did. And even went to the county attorney, and the county attorney said, "You're an elected official. You're fair game for that."
But it seems like bad apples in the media are giving everybody this blanket bad reputation, Talia.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And if you look at public opinion about the media over time, it's these moments where someone is caught copying something, or these moments where someone is a bad actor that really poison the well and lead to a lot of people saying, oh, the media are just out to get us, and they're not acting in the best interest of the public or acting as in good faith to convey to the public what's happening at the level of government. And I think that's really worrisome, because if we then discount all media on the basis of these instances as members of the public or as members of government and elected officials, then they're not able to serve their role in a democracy. So I think we have to really think about how trust is broken down and how these really pivotal moments cause trust to break down, and what are ways in which we can restore faith in the media overall.
And I think social media, we have to discuss that, because that has been at the forefront of these accusations of fake news. And indeed, truly, there was a lot of fake news that went out via Facebook. I saw a statistic. I was reading Bob Schieffer's book on, it's called Overload, and just how we're just inundated with so much media right now. He said the top 20 false news stories in 2016 during the election got more likes, clicks, and shares than the most popular stories on the top 19 true news organizations. How can we combat that? Any answers? I mean, how do we get people to understand the difference between real journalism and fake news, if I don't really like that term? But
Well, one of my concerns is, we talk about an informed citizenry. I never could say that word. Well, they're getting information, but are they really informed? Right? So I think it's part of what we here at the University of Texas would like to do, is start training the public to identify how to find good news sources online, training them how to get past the first page of a Google search, how to tell what's a really good social media site and what isn't, what are the best apps. You can now put a photograph into Google and find out, its provenance. You can verify it. Teaching people how to do that so they feel a little bit more armed or about what's out there. But I think that's one of my issues, is that how do you become quote unquote informed, and what does that mean in the 21st century, as opposed to just having information thrown at you. You said facts are debatable. To me, there are all kinds of facts. The fact is my dress is blue and peach, but is that important? So it's not to me so much that facts are debatable, but what is truth? You can throw out all kinds of facts, but how do we approach truth?
And I think that's the key role of journalists. I remember Woodward and Bernstein saying, we were just trying to find the truth. I mean, to me, that is the role of journalists in our government, is to find the truth and give people the best information possible so they can make good decisions, informed decisions about their lives and their families. And Natalie, I mean, Talia, you're going to weigh in on that, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's another component to this, which is telling people to be really careful and look up the news that they consume is a really important skill that we have to teach them. But the fact of the matter is, I can sit here and say, I cannot do that for every piece of news that crosses my feed. I would be consuming news from a week ago, still trying to keep up with it right now. So I think that there's a component of overload that happens if you do this in all instances. So I think there's not only a role for citizens, but I think there's also a responsibility for those organizations that act as conduits for sharing things like fake news, or whatever you want to call this phenomena, which is, how can you make it easier for people? So Facebook's move to include related articles that include fact checks below potentially problematic fake news, I think, is a step in the right direction. People don't have time to do these heavy lifts for every piece of information, and so I think the more we can raise to the fore easier ways of doing this, I think that's really helpful for people.
But Judy, not to hurt your feelings, since you come from the world of all of this media, it's not all just the media. People are lazy with really going and, you have to ferret out information. And you've got so many ways to get information today. The unfortunate thing is there are places where you think, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to really be able to get some really good, credible information, only to find out that, oh, I mean, but I didn't know that. And we're in a world of instant gratification. We want to live in the now. Speed was one of those things that was brought up earlier. And speed in media, I think, are not friends of each other. But people try to get so fast the information and get it out, and they don't really know, and sometimes they don't care whether it's accurate or not, but they sure want to make sure that they get to be the first on the scene with disseminating, some information.
Well, in the old days, before the internet came to be, we used to make sure we had 3 sources, for every story, especially a story that's controversial. So, well, we need to confirm that. We need to confirm that again. We need to confirm it one more time. Nobody, very few people do that anymore. Okay.
Well, actually, I would say people, there are news organizations that are doing that, but when they do it, we don't pay attention. If the audiences aren't respecting the organizations that do that, or not willing to pay for the organizations that do that, you get what you pay for.
Well, the New York Times and the Washington Post are seeing a huge surge in the number of people who are subscribing to them. So I think that is a good sign because, in my mind, those are 2 very trusted news organizations. Let's talk about echo chambers because a lot of people are watching, and then I want to get some questions from the audience, Shilpa, if you want to pick a couple of good ones. I feel like a lot of people, because of social media, are living in their echo chambers. They're consuming news that agrees with their point of view. So no one is finding out the other side. And I think that's contributing to the polarization of our country politically. Let's talk about that and ways we can try to combat that as well.
Yeah, so it's absolutely the case that people tend to look at news that matches their political beliefs, and there's loads and loads of evidence that this happens. And one of the consequences of that is when you are looking at news that matches your beliefs, you start to develop more politically polarized attitudes. You think that your party is right and the other party is wrong. And they've done all sorts of surveys looking at these increases in polarization. You even see it on really interesting measures that we used to use to study racism and racial prejudice, of things like, would you be willing to let your kid marry someone from the opposite party? An increasing percentage of the public says, no, I would not be willing to let my child marry someone from the opposite party. And I think that these sorts of echo chambers that are developing just feed these sorts of attitudes, and social media most certainly amplifies this because not only does it involve our self-selection of wanting to look at information that agrees with us, but then we have algorithms that are learning what we like and then offer us more of it. So I think that it's a really worrisome trend, and I think that the more we're talking about it and informing people, like, look, these things are happening. Think about how you can consume news outside of your own bubble, and look at it with a charitable eye. So don't just dismiss it right out of hand. I think that's a really important
And make sure
thing that
those
we need
things
to
are
do.
in your feed too.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the, I think the idea that you can get information 24/7 is not a good idea. I mean, I almost wish we could go back, like there's a fireplace, like you have a fire or a waterfall, and then when something important happens, we'll break in and tell you. Other than that, we don't need talking heads. The amount of news on quote-unquote cable channels of actual news is maybe, 2 hours?
And then it's repeated and repeated
And then it's repeated.
yeah.
And if you look at the graphics, we have, and I invite you all to come visit us at the University of Texas, but we have this room that has TV monitors in it, and you can see it's the same thing being said over and over and over again. And sometimes I just change it to like KLRU and put on the dinosaur train or something. But so that's one of the things I worry about, that there's a lot of information out there, but that's not really news, and I think that feeds into that echo chamber.
Gerald, where do you get your news? I'm just curious since you're the non-journalist up here.
Yeah, well, I really try to go to a lot of different places. I mean, there are 53 partisan elected office holders in Travis County. 51 are Democrats. I am one of 2 of 53 Republicans that is elected out of Travis County. So I generally am trying to go to the opposite party to find out what it is that they are talking about. I don't need to listen, I can listen to Rush Limbaugh for about 20 minutes and then, my head explodes. So I'll go right to CNN. And that alone, Judy, I mean, the fact that I would say that I'll go to CNN, well, what does that tell you? I automatically think that CNN is a very slanted left side. I think that the University of Texas and what they teach. I've been here 50 years. I went to the University of Texas. When you go to the University of Texas campus, I mean, the part of the party that is very active, very engaged, very aggressive is the Democrat Party on campus. Even some of the Greeks, find themselves in that in that role. But I try to go to as many places as I can to get as rounded package of information, and then make my decision from there. I mean, fortunately, a commissioner, you don't really have a lot of things that you ought to be dealing with from a partisan standpoint. I mean,
Talking about roads and bridges.
Well, yeah, talk about, infrastructure, talk about the things that you need to talk about, and don't let something become so politicized that you don't do the right thing just because it's a party affiliation. I think that I'm known for that in this community. People know me to be a Republican, but they certainly know that I'm somebody that's going to be very straightforward with you, and if you've got a good idea, I'm not asking you what party you're from. I want to know what it is that you need, and if that makes sense for the community, that's what we ought to be doing. But I try to be well-rounded.
It's an important perspective. Shilpa, do you have a couple of good questions from the audience?
do. So I found this one really interesting. Isn't there a code of ethics that journalists follow, and what are the consequences when there is a journalistic ethics lapse?
Good.
There is, okay, first of all, as you know, we're the only industry mentioned in the Bill of Rights, right? The news industry is the only one mentioned. But we're not licensed in this country, which goes to your point of, many people call themselves journalists who we may not, those of us in the profession, but there is no license. So we have codes of ethics, and every publication also has its own separate code of what's allowed and what's not allowed. If there is a lapse and people find out about it, the journalists lose their jobs. They should lose their jobs. I was at the times when Jason Blair famously was making up stories. And I actually saw him in his office one day. Weren't you in Virginia yesterday? So things like that do happen. But, I think part of what we're also talking about here, what happened to the commissioner, is that action penalized? If it's not, then how do we, as the young people would say, shame, organizations that do that type of behavior?
You have another one?
Sure. So this is also, I think, interesting. How do we deal with the influx of corporate money and media ownership / how has that consolidation of media outlets impacted news?
I'll take that one first. This is also an issue near and dear to my heart. Especially in the television news world, huge conglomerates are buying up local television stations. And I think that the phrase is, when two stories are of equal importance, lead with the one that's closest to the flagpole. That's not happening more and more. And people turn to news locally because they want to hear what's going on in their community. They can get the national news just about any place. But what's happened is large corporations like Sinclair have come up and bought local news that not only have a political agenda, they have must-run stories that need to go on these broadcasts. And they have nothing to do with the community. They're stories about something going on in Washington. When I was at KI and Sinclair bought us, we had a negative story about the Affordable Care Act, I would say 20 out of 30 days that we had to run. So I've experienced this firsthand, and I think this homogenization and corporatization and companies that have a political agenda dictating what a community newsroom covers is very troubling. Anybody else want to take that one?
Well, it's the same as lobby. I mean, it's, effectively, that's what you're talking about. People with influence, and, you're pretty influential when you own the station. One of the things that I would like to know from the audience, do you think that it's that it's good to have one newspaper in town versus a second newspaper. I mean, for so long, most of your major metropolitan areas had two newspapers. Now, that I don't know that you get anything necessarily good.
But I think competition is important. I think that is one of the
I
things
think
that's
it
missing
is.
today.
That's my point. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, but the newspaper industry, the print industry has shrunk so much. I mean, not to say, I mean, if you're out there with Community Impact or the Chronicle, don't take that as a slight. But your large newspapers are the ones that I'm talking about. And I don't know that there are any cities in the country, I'm sure there are, that have more. New York, has obviously, more than one, but not very many. And I think that is something that can be of an issue, in a local community.
Kathleen and Talia, but I know Kathleen has a print background. Go ahead, Talia.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add is I 100% agree with what you both have mentioned so far, but the only thing I would add is that the news industry is in trouble right now, and there are a lot of indications that layoffs and all sorts of problems. And so just to throw another perspective out there, there's something when a conglomerate is coming together that can take advantage of economies of scale, because then they can say, okay, well, we're going to house all of the technology needs in one place, and then farm these out to all these other organizations or small news outlets, so then they can actually sustain themselves better because all of these organizations are taking advantage of the same infrastructure. So while there are definitely negative sides in the political component of it,
From a
it's
financial
very
aspect,
troubling.
it's keeping some local
But
stations
there's some
afloat.
good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as someone who worked in local television for 30 plus years, I think that the local TV stations in Austin do a tremendous job. And there's some really stellar reporters doing very good work at those stations.
I think news consumers need to know who owns the organizations they're reading. They need to know the politics, the business model, all that type of stuff. It's like, at one point I was boycotting Mobil because of the way its oil business was doing, or something like that. Like, I want to know who's doing what, and I think here in Austin, this is an issue. I won't go into it, but you should know who's owning your local media and who will own your local media.
Good point. Let's talk about Facebook a little bit more. I know that your video went viral, and I want to talk to you about that. I know you're not a Facebook person, Commissioner, but Facebook is constantly changing. Right now they've changed this algorithm, and in our business at KLRU, with this brand new model of engagement journalism, we are Facebook first. When we do our stories, we're Facebook first, and then we curate the stories and have a half-hour TV special on KLRU. But it's really frustrating to we have these compelling, in-depth stories, and then sometimes they just don't get a lot of likes and shares. And even more so now that they've changed the algorithm for videos and everything else. So Facebook has truly changed the face, if pardon the pun, of journalism in our country. Good, bad, ugly, wonderful. What do you all think about news via Facebook?
You go first, Talia.
Okay. I think that it's a mixed picture. I think that we have to be really mindful that 60% or so of the public is going to Facebook and getting news, and that's a lot of power in the hands of one social media company. And that when they change their algorithm to deprioritize news or to affect whether videos are going to be prioritized or not, and some companies have invested a lot in that, they actually have repercussions not only for the business model of the journalism industry, but also for whether citizens are finding news and information in their feed, where so many people are increasingly saying that they're relying upon social media as a source of news. So I'm worried about that much power in one place, that with one simple switch from one day to the next can have tremendous repercussions, both for the informed public and for the business model of journalism. So that would be my major takeaway.
Kathleen?
There's a media theory called gatekeeping, and for the longest, journalists decided what news you got. News is constructed. So if you pick up the Statesman, which I happen to have here. I'm very old school today.
I still get the newspaper.
Someone decides what stories are important, what gets to be the big headline, what goes where. So what we call news is someone has decided what is news. What's interesting is now we have a technology company and not journalists per se deciding what information is put before consumers. And it's sort of like, okay, I go to a hospital, but now the hospital doesn't decide the treatment. Not to say that journalism is like saving lives, sometimes it is, but it's like you have this different force, deciding what is news, and that's one way to look at it.
Gene, let me say something about Facebook.
All right.
Yes, you had intimated that I'm not a Facebook user. Obviously, I have a Facebook page, but I elect not to engage with it. I can't not have my life start out every day where somebody has lit you up and people are bold behind a keyboard.
It's anonymity. Sure.
It got to the point to where people would say things and you go, well, that's just patently nowhere near accurate or true. And then, boom, you hit it and it goes, all over the place. Obviously, it was very advantageous for Charlotte and I to have done,
right. Well, that's
the
what I was
ad.
going to ask you. The flip side of that is that your ad went viral. And Facebook was a big part of that, YouTube, all the many ways. How do you think the media covered you in this ad, and why did you choose to utilize this humor? It was a funny spot. Why did you choose to go that route?
Well, I've never really done an attacking ad in all the times that I've run for office. I've always thought that you ought to do an ad that tells folks what you believe in. There was a subtle message there. Most people told me, said, you had to watch it a couple, 3 times before the message is that you're sort of nerdy about, statistics, and you really think every day about, everything from the jail population to, a diesel machine running in a neighborhood that people are really upset about. After we did the commercial that only cost $7,000 and only took 4 hours to do and got 10 million, hits and went to all 7 continents, my wife and I went, do you think that thing's going to be very good after we finished the commercial? And, the first day it went 38,000 views. Well, of course, I'm 68 and I don't know what 38,000 views means. So my 26-year-old office manager says, Commissioner, that's big. And the next day it had gotten to 60,000. And I went, wow. I said, what's that term, viral? How many do you have to get before you really consider it viral? She goes, I think you're past that. And so it was something that we had no idea that the thing was going to do what it did. When we were interviewed on all of the CNNs, the Fox, everything, people were asking, well, what do you think about this and why did this happen? And I just turned the thing around and asked them, I said, I need to ask y'all that. Y'all are the ones wanting to interview us on every media, channel, and so what was it? And they said, you never said what party you were. You never said anything about the person that you were running against. And quite frankly, it was just lighthearted enough that it captured people, and that's what it was. But we didn't have any idea that would happen.
Can I add something to that? The thing about that commercial was it was decent. And I think this is an age in which I know I'm trying to preach to my students decency. And it's something that is clearly lacking, but that ad in that era in which it was introduced, I think people found it as something that, hey, I can enjoy this. This is done by a decent person.
I also think that it appealed to the younger generation, and that's one thing I want to discuss is the generational divide and how we consume news. Television is still where 57% of Americans get their news. Only 27% of people under 30 choose television. So really that generational impact is truly impacting how we consume news. So what can we as journalists do to bring more millennials into the fold of quality journalism? And that's not an easy answer, but Talia, you want to start with that?
I would say meeting young people where they're at. They're not going to TV, and I don't think any jazzy TV special is going to all of a sudden bring them in. But they are on Snapchat. They are on Instagram.
YouTube.
They are on YouTube. And I think that figuring out what they're consuming there and how you can reach them where they're at is absolutely the right way to do it. And we even see it in our teaching. If you're meeting your students where they're at and saying, hey, did you see this on YouTube yesterday? I mean, there's something compelling about doing that. And it's not as though it's a wholehearted change in what journalism is doing. It's just using different outlets and different media forms to reach this audience.
And I think one of the key things we have to figure out is in past generations, young people didn't follow the news decades ago either. But then they became older people with children and paying taxes, and then they needed to follow the news. So I guess one of the questions is, at what point, but we've got a generation of students I know whose parents didn't consume news the way our parents did. So I think the issue is if millennials stay in the kind of in a non-news consumption manner, then we've lost something. Because the other thing that we always had is that 20-year-olds turn into 30-year-olds who turn into 40-year-olds who turn into 50-year-olds, right? So there are plenty of people still reading newspapers. The problem, or traditional media, is just there's not that flock behind them who have been trained how to follow traditional news.
Do you have any more questions from the audience?
I kind of found this one fascinating, and it speaks to a lot of what we've already talked about, but how do we separate truth versus opinion in the news as
Oh, wow.
consumers of media?
Our students are actually going to be making videos about that.
Really?
And I would say that it's incredibly difficult to do that. Indeed, if you ask even experts, is this totally factual reporting or is there opinion included here, you'll get diverse opinion. So that's, I think, really exceptionally tricky. One initiative that I think more news organizations are trying out is more clearly labeling different sections of the paper. So saying, or even different sections online to say, this is analysis, this is opinion, this is news. And I think that those efforts are potentially helpful to give people a clear cue of this is where we're categorizing this. So I think that's at least a helpful thing news organizations are doing.
It's very difficult online. There are days when I'm looking at the Washington Post and it's like, wait a second, what is this? And I'll know, oh, this is an opinion piece.
It's an editorial, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's very hard. And that's the other thing, people aren't quite sure of the facts. Like, okay, reported articles, analysis, opinion, op-ed, which by the way, all op-ed meant was opposite the editorial. And now it's become its own thing. So there are all these terms that we almost need to explain. And this is why the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal are creating videos about the news process.
What do you see as the future of print media, since you worked in that journalism media for so long? How do you think newspapers need to redefine and deliver? They're already doing a lot of that with these videos and online presence.
Well, my last job at the Times was running the web newsroom. So, and the Times, and I guess I'm not on their payroll anymore. So there's still a very, very vigorous print product because the ads pay a lot more than the online ads, right? I think that's even the case for the Statesman. And I know Community Impact, it's definitely like the ads are there, it's tangible and it's real. So it's interesting, print papers were making money, but Wall Street thought they weren't making enough money. And that also led to the devastation of the news industry. It's not just online versus print. So there were some things that were happening in the 90s that really affected, and Talia, I'm sure you've studied this and probably know more about this than I do, but some of the actions of Wall Street have also led to the demise of a lot of newsrooms.
I think it's interesting that the Statesman has had such a huge change in the last couple of years. They don't print it here, and printing it in San Antonio, it's not fake news, it's old news. I mean, you would have seen it, 6 or 7 times before you have to read something in the Statesman, which I think is very, very difficult to draw readership, for the Statesman. I mean, I think if it weren't for the automobile industry, the newspaper would dry up, because the automobile industry probably has, I would venture to say, 50% of the ads, in a newspaper is automobile advertising. I'm in real question as to whether or not your major print media will be around much longer. I mean, they're doing everything they can to make ends meet, and maybe it's not as much money as they would like to make. I mean, they'd take their money and put it in other places, where they can get a bigger return. But I still read the Statesman, but I realize that it's older news, and that's troublesome to me.
I think even the Statesman folk, and I worked for the Statesman back in the 80s, by the way, would agree that they were happy that the Longhorns weren't that good because they had 11 a.m. kickoffs. So it was guaranteed to make the print product, So no, it is hard with their early deadlines. And I remember having a conversation with someone at the Times in the 90s when the real estate sections were huge, but you'd look at an ad for an apartment that was $200,000 and it was next to an ad to $1 million apartment. And I said to the real estate people at a retreat, it's like, well, why would I ever look at this in print anymore when it's so much easier to do it online, and talking about real estate? And they said, oh, no, people will always have real estate ads. It's like, no, they didn't. So to your point about the automobile industry.
Yeah, and I think that it's just a change in what sort of content is covered, because now that we have the internet and that's where you're getting breaking news more frequently, now it's almost as though newspapers need to become the magazines, where they're taking the longer amount of time to synthesize and offer more analysis of what's happening. But that's
Do you think
tricky.
that is maybe where the future lies for newspapers as far as the print version? Because they're still making money with the online. I mean, as I said, the New York Times and Washington Post have more subscribers online than they've ever had. Do you think that the actual physical newspaper, though, will be going away in the next 10 or 15 years? Or do you think there's enough of us in the baby boom generation that we have to have? My husband has to have the crossword puzzle on his newspaper.
And then, comics. I prefer comics
And
in
the
print.
comics, yeah.
But, it's interesting. If you ever watch HGTV, and I watch it nonstop religiously, which I know. I watch Maine Cabin Masters. I don't even know why. But one of the things you always hear people say, oh, it looks like it's from a magazine. When they do the review, oh, it looks like a magazine. So we say people aren't reading print products, but there is this glamour associated. When Obama was elected in 2008, I said to someone at the Times newsroom, you better have a lot of newspapers because my people will come and get copies. And they said, oh, we have enough. And of course, there were lines around the corner. So there is this thing that
It's
people still like to
tangible.
hold. Yes.
It's almost the difference between having letters from people you love and you want to keep those tangible things. And it makes me sad that nowadays most people communicate via email, and in generations from now they won't see, love letters between parents or things like that. Is there any more from the audience that you'd like to?
Well, I'm not really sure that this is a little bit of a, it's an interesting question. Isn't this
She's our
really a part?
gatekeeper.
I know, I'm like, it might open up interesting cans of worms, and so I like that. Isn't this really a part of a larger trend of anti-intellectualism in American culture? And I think it kind of goes on to say what they're meaning is the ability to digest in-depth journalism or kind of question this, or maybe the inability to do so. Is all of this kind of a part of that anti-intellectualism trend?
Well, it does take time to digest a long story, a long feature story that does go in depth. That's an interesting question. Anybody want to tackle that one?
I do fear that people no longer respect gaining knowledge and being informed, and it goes hand in hand with creating echo chambers, and it goes hand in hand into ceding responsibility to people maybe you shouldn't cede responsibility to. I remember a time when the difference between Democrats and Republicans, by the way, and this is in the 60s even, was maybe this, you know? There were moderate Republicans, there were Dixiecrats. I mean, things were not as
Polarized.
yeah, polarized. So it does trouble me to the point that the people who are anti-intellectual are trying to make sure, are trying to keep people from being informed so they can't make good decisions, right? That's ultimately the goal. An uninformed public is a public that doesn't know what's going on. Kind of obvious.
As our role in the Fourth Estate, what do you see as ways journalists can help bring the country to help see one another's point of view? What are some ways, some tangible ways that we can do that as journalists? I know at KLRU, we have the fortune of being a PBS station, so we often hold town community meetings and have people with different viewpoints really talk openly, respectfully, and kindly to one another, but really, truly listen to one another. When Donald Trump was inaugurated, I brought people from all sections of the community to watch together. And it was so fascinating hearing them share their thoughts and ideas and hopes and dreams for the future. These were Democrats, Republicans, immigrants, and I guess that's one way we can do it. But what are some other ways that journalists can play a role in getting our country talking again respectfully and not in this polarized, camped perspective?
As an elected official, Judy, I'm not sure that that's possible. I think that it is spinning more out of control because I'm not seeing people willing to try to come together. I do think that it's being pushed to the point to where some of this will be irrelevant because people just aren't willing to listen to someone if they think that someone is over here versus where they think they should be. I don't know that you can pull them, to the center to say, we have to have a sea change. And I do think that media is going to have to try and get some sort of reputation back. I told you this morning when I got here that I was listening to KLBJ on the way over here. And they had the mayor on, and it was uncomfortable just listening, to the exchange. I listen to KLBJ each morning, and the worst thing you can do as an elected official is call in. You are really stupid to do that because you only get about a minute and a half, and they get about 3 hours. But it's so annoying to me to have very popular people with their ratings just talk about things that they have no idea what they're talking about. They're just opinions, and they will get the community so lit up. Mm-hmm. And I have texted Don Pryor and said, do you want me to call in and straighten out what the sobriety center is? Because it's not just a tank where you just take drunks and you just throw them in there and let them wallow around on the taxpayer's dime. I mean, there is more to it. And he said, yeah, why don't you call in? But the media has a responsibility to not be speedy, but to be as accurate as they can. And I think that is the harm that has been created for the media because it's more about speed than it is about accuracy, and that's my opinion.
Well, you know what? I would actually say what you're talking about isn't speed. It's that thing of people having to fill the airwaves for a long time. Because you're right. It's like, I mean, I listen to a lot of sports, and they'll have a small soundbite from Shaka Smart, and then they'll talk about it for the next 4 hours. Yeah. So again, I wonder what we're calling quote unquote news. Is that really news? And I also kind of agree with you, and I know Talia wants to talk, that I wonder that there's certain parts that are just like gone, and we just need to find those who are just refusing to follow news because they're either tired or they don't know how, and try to find those folk.
Yeah, and just a couple of thoughts on this. So one is at the Center for Media Engagement, we hold digital newsroom roundtables where we bring in news leaders from across the country and just get them to brainstorm on problems they're facing and how they might fix it. And we had a session where we said, polarization is an issue facing the country, what would you do to fix it? And one comment from that still resonates with me, which is a person from the media said, well, is it really in our interest to address polarization? I mean, doesn't that really help us get more clicks? And I was really concerned about that because I think it's a very short-term perspective because, yeah, it's going to help you get clicks tomorrow. But if you feed this, if you take a long-term perspective as the media, as an organization that wants to try to be objective, forgive my use of the term, I know it's quite controversial, but if you want to try to reach people across the aisle, you can't have that as your business model. It won't work in the long term. And so I think that efforts like the one you're talking about, where you're trying to humanize people on both sides, yeah, there are some you will never be able to reach. But if you try to show people, here is someone with a view different from your own, and look, they're a parent too, and they're here in Austin as well, I think you start to realize, like, wait, we have more in common than we do pulling us apart.
Yeah. Okay, we're almost out of time, so I want each of you to give a call to action. This is how we end every Engaged Breakfast. So would each of you give our audience members maybe just a small actionable way we can all be more thoughtful consumers of news?
I'll go first. I think when you are talking with people, and it can be anyone, it can just be someone that you've met through another friend or whatever, and try to engage in a conversation that that may be an issue-oriented kind of topic in Austin. And if you find that someone is not as knowledgeable as they need to be, obviously you've got to be talking to them about something that you know something about, and let them know, I'm trying to give you information, not opinion. But we've got to engage this community in good, factual information about the things that we know need to take place and need to happen in this community. Because I'm afraid if we don't, then we're just going to see that divide get wider and wider. So my question for you is are you willing to do that? And you all are a pretty decent barometer. You got up at 6 o'clock this morning or whatever time you had to get up to put yourself together and get here. So you are someone that I want to touch and that I want, to be able to relate to. So I appreciate you coming out this morning and hope you got something out of this.
Did. Kathleen?
Well, I would say that we all need to model curiosity in being informed, especially to younger people. People need to see us, oh, I don't know that, I'm going to look it up, and I'm going to look it up in a credible source. I mean, you all need to be sort of like ambassadors of trying to spread being informed, and I think that's important, and that's what, again, at the University of Texas, we want to come up with ways that we can help, and not just like-minded, Austinites, but we need to do this for the entire state.
And I would say that my takeaway would be the word charity, that you should look at news and information that doesn't necessarily agree with you, but don't do it to laugh at the other side or bolster your own arguments. Do it with a charitable perspective of where is this other person coming from, and can I understand the values that might undergird this? And maybe I don't totally agree, but at least I can see where they're coming from. And I think we would be a lot further if a lot more people practiced more charity.
Gerald, Kathleen, and Talia, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And of course, Shilpa, for being all of your voice today. This was a wonderful discussion, and I'm so glad that we could share so many different perspectives on a topic that I care so deeply about. So thank you.
No, thank the audience.